Contrast that with continuous measurement procedures. Discontinuous measurement procedures means that we're going to measure samples, or not every instance of the behavior per session. There are three primary types of discontinuous measurement procedures: partial interval measures, whole interval measures, and momentary time sampling. So before we talk about the different types, I want to make sure that you know what an interval is. When I say an interval, what I mean is a length of time. In applied behavior analysis, we're going to try to make, for comparison's sake, intervals always to be the same amount of time between what we're comparing. So for example, I would not compare something that had a 30-second interval to something that had a 10-second interval. We would want to make them equal. Basically, we're striving when we're comparing to be comparing two of the same things. But for this discussion's sake, for an RBT, I want you to know that an interval is a length of time. So, let's say I break a minute into two 30-second periods. I could say each is a 30-second interval. From this, we'll be able to calculate a percentage of time the behavior occurred. So, an example result might say something like this: the patient was in seat 55% of the time. Again, from these discontinuous measures, we'll be able to calculate a percentage of time that the behavior occurred, and we can compare across time. Partial and whole interval recording and momentary time sampling gives us an estimation of the number of behaviors that are occurring or that the individual engages in. These are nice because we don't have to record every single instance of a behavior, but we do have to have a little bit of setup, and we'll go over that here in a minute. So, before we start examples, let's select our interval length. Let's say that we're going to do a 10-minute observation, and then we're going to break this into 20 intervals. Remember, we're going to make those intervals the same length. The intervals will be then 30 seconds. So we will have 20 30-second intervals. Here's what an example chart might look like. Notice there are 20 intervals on there. Now a real one is probably going to have a lot more instructions on it. For example, what your interval is going to be and what behavior you're looking at. But this is just for illustration purposes. Another consideration when using these measurements is you're going to want to have something that can non-intrusively tell you when an interval is up. I myself am a little old school. I use what's called a motivator. It gives you a little buzz, and you can set for different interval lengths. To be honest with you, I'm not sure if there's any phone app that does that. Although I'm sure there is, where you can set like a stopwatch or something that buzzes every 30 seconds or every 20, whatever the interval length is. But basically you want it to be non-intrusive. If you're simply just doing an observation, such as in a classroom, you may be able to use like the watch or the clock or something on the second hand. That may not be quite as accurate as you might like. But basically you're going to want to have something that can signal you when each interval is done. Another thing I like to do is to make sure that every interval is marked, whether a behavior occurred or not. Now you'll see in the examples in a few minutes what it's going to look like. But here, this example, see that X right there? I might put that, and it helps me to keep track of what interval I'm on. So, for example, if a behavior did not occur in interval 1, I might just put the X before I move on to interval 2. So like when the buzz goes off, when I know the interval's up, I'll put an X just so I know that nothing occurred in that interval and that I'm also currently on interval 2. That's just a practice I do. You don't need to do that, but it helps to keep track of what interval you're on. So now we can talk about what these actually are. Whole interval recording. In a whole interval recording, the behavior must occur for the whole interval for the interval to be marked as having the behavior occurred. This will give us an underestimation of the behavior because it has to happen for the whole interval. So, for example, let's say we're doing in-seat behavior, which is what we're going to track here. For it to be marked, the person would have to be in seat the entire interval. So let's say the person sits in the seat for 29 seconds but gets up. Because it wasn't for the whole interval, we don't mark it as occurring. This is why it gives us an underestimation of behavior. As an analyst, personally, I use this for tracking desired behavior because I'd rather have an underestimation of that, because if we see an improvement, that means something really is going on. Although this is not a rule. I want to stress that. It's not a rule. What kind of recording you're going to use is going to depend on what the analyst tells you to use. So, for this example, we're going to do in-seat behavior. If you notice that on the top, there's an operational definition of what that means. JM has to be in his seat with feet on the ground. This is what the chart would look like filled out. Remember, I'm using those X's to keep track of where I'm at. So, in interval 1, in all the 30 seconds, for the whole interval, he was not in seat. Same for interval 2. But interval 3, you see I put that plus. And so remember, that's a strategy I use to mark intervals that are already over with the X. If you do that, make sure that the mark that you're doing for an interval where the actual behavior occurred looks different. So here I use a plus. So on this example chart, pluses equal the behavior occurred, X means it did not occur. So remember, for me to mark that plus, the behavior would have had to have occurred through the whole 30-second interval. So JM was in his seat for the whole 30 seconds in interval 3. And that's how it would look filled out. So as you can see on there, in interval 3, 5, 6, 11, 14, 15, 18, and 19, JM was in his seat for the entire 30-second interval. From here, I can calculate a percentage of intervals. So let's do that. Percentage of intervals. We're going to take the number of intervals that it occurred in. So here, there was 8 intervals that were marked as the behavior occurring. And we're going to divide by the total number of intervals, which was 20. And we're going to multiply that by 100 to get the percentage of intervals. So we're going to take that 8, we're going to divide it by 20. This gives us an answer of 0.4. Then we're going to multiply that by 100. This gives us 40. So we can say that in 40% of intervals, the patient was in seat. Partial interval recording. The behavior must occur only one time during the interval for the interval to be marked. This gives us an overestimation of behavior because it only has to happen once during the interval. Sorry, my throat was a little raspy there, so I'll read that again. The behavior must occur only one time during the interval for the interval to be marked. This gives us an overestimation of the behavior because it only has to happen once during the interval. So in our example, JM only has to be in the seat, let's say, for 2 seconds out of that 30 seconds, and we can mark it as occurring. As an analyst, I sometimes will use this with problematic behavior to overestimate how much is actually happening. But again, that's not a rule. So here, I'm going to mark each instance. Don't compare this to the last graph. This is totally different. They're different chart. So, as you can see, I put the pluses and x's. Remember, the pluses are corrects, or that means the behavior occurred sometime in that interval, and the x is just me tracking what interval I'm on. So again, in partial interval recording, all the person has to do is engage in the behavior at any time during that interval, and it's marked as occurring. So let's say in interval 1, he was only in his seat for 3 seconds. But because it's partial interval, again, partial, it only has to occur one time or more during that interval, we'll mark it as happening. Again, we can calculate a percentage of intervals. Here, there were 12 pluses. That means that in 12 of the intervals, at some point during those intervals, he was engaged in in-seat behavior. So we're going to take that number 12, divide it by 20, it gets 0.6. That times it by 100, so we can say that in 60% of intervals, that patient was in their seat. Finally, we come to momentary time sampling. Here, the person only checks to see if the behavior is occurring at the time the interval is up. So in our example, they will be checking every 30 seconds. The signal or buzz will go off, and they will mark if the person was engaged in the behavior or not. Use the same data sheet. It is also a discontinuous measurement because you're not measuring each instance of the behavior. It underestimates behavior, but momentary time sampling is good in instances when the observer is engaged elsewhere or very busy. Typically when I'm having teachers record data, this is the most popular one because they don't have time because they have a ton of other students to keep track of. So basically what I'm telling them is that, hey, like every time, like let's say a minute or 45 seconds, look up and see if the person is engaged in the behavior. They mark if they were or they don't or not. Here we're doing 30 seconds, remember. So I would tell the person at the 30-second point, look up. If the person is engaged in the behavior, mark the interval as it having occurred. If not, just keep track of what interval you're on. I put the X's, so there it is right there. It would look the same. The data sheet would look the same. So in interval 1, the person looked up at the 30-second point. JM was not in their seat, so they put an X. Interval 2 occurred. So at the 30-second point of interval 2, so now we're a whole minute into it, looked up, JM was not in their seat, so they mark X. At the minute and 30 point, so the next 30-second interval is up, they look up, and JM was in his seat, so they would put a plus. Likewise in 4, 5, and 6, the teacher looked up, or the observer looked up, and each one of those, when the interval was over, JM was in his seat. So as you can see, the person only has a 10 once that signal goes off to see if the person is engaged in the behavior. We can do the same thing and calculate a percentage of intervals. Here, there was 11 times he was in his seat when the teacher or observer looked up. We take that 11, divide by 20, which gets us 0.55, multiply that by 100, gets us 55. So we can say through MTS or momentary time sampling, he was in his seat 55% of the observation. Discontinuous measurement procedures. We measure the samples of the behavior. We're not measuring every instance. Remember, like in whole interval, we're not measuring every instance of the behavior. We're just seeing if the behavior occurred at all for the whole interval. So if it's this 30-second interval and the behavior occurred for 10 seconds, and they stopped. So let's say JM got out of his seat. We no longer have to record whether he sits back down in his seat again in 5 seconds because we know that whole interval doesn't count. And in partial interval, once he sits down one time in that interval, that's the only one we have to look at. So let's say he sits down one time, stays in his seat for 5 seconds, gets up for like 10 seconds, sits back down. We're not keeping track of each instance of the behavior. We already marked that interval as occurring because it was partial interval. He already did it. In a momentary time sampling, we're only seeing at the 30-second point or whatever the point is. So in that way, we're not measuring every single instance of behavior. Again, we're estimating, or this is an estimation. We use discontinuous measurement in ABA to give us an estimation, a percentage, or it allows us to do a percentage of intervals that the behavior is occurring in. We can compare these percentages over time. We can say that at the beginning of the year, JM was in his seat 55% of intervals. By October, he was in his seat 70% of intervals. But remember, when we're comparing across time, we're going to want to be using the same intervals. So I would use in October the same amount of same 30-second interval as I did at the beginning of the year. And I would use the same type of measurement. So if I use partial interval at the beginning of the year, I'm going to use partial interval in October. So essentially, we're comparing across time.